no further ado, I will ask Jessie Keaveney to join us to share her thoughts on why this is a worthwhile endeavor. Thank you, Jessie.
Okay. Well, hello, everyone. I want to thank Mass General for once again allowing me to open the session by presenting my perspectives as an at-risk, genetically at-risk person. There we go. So I learned about my genetic risk 9 years ago in 2013. I learned that I had the LARC2 G2019S variant. And I immediately rolled in a biomarker study, and I've been participating in research ever since. And this slide represents most of the studies that I've participated in over those last 9 years. And I've had positive experiences from my research participation, and in many ways it's helped me to overcome any kind of fear. And I've chosen to be open and public about my genetic risk from the very beginning, and I can honestly say that it's never been an issue for me, that I've absolutely had no regrets. And many people who are genetically at risk for Parkinson's have a family history of the condition. I think that's an important distinction regarding my at-risk category. And many of you might be familiar with my family story from my presentation last year. And I don't have time today to go into many of those details, but I encourage you to check out my personal story on the Cure Parkinson's YouTube channel. I'm 45 years old right now, and I'm the same exact age that my grandfather was when he was diagnosed with Parkinson's in the early 1950s. He had experimental brain operation at the Neurological Institute in New York in 1957. And this is actually the surgical logbook documenting his surgery. And I found some letters written to my grandmother from my grandfather's neurosurgeon, and I read them on that video. And I also talk about the results of my dad's brain pathology following brain donation in 2021. And some of my dad's brain pathology pictures are actually shown on this slide. And I also wanted to bring your attention to a link to my presentation from last year's symposium that can be found on the Excel events platform. If you go to agenda and then click on opening session, you can see a link to my video at the bottom. And I don't want to repeat too much of the information from last year, but if you can go back and watch that, it helps you to understand my motivations for research and also my thoughts on returning information back to participants in studies. So there's two updates since last year that I wanted to share with you. And first, my 20-year-old son, Carson, is in the audience with me today. He's a junior at Georgia Tech studying computer science. And I have his permission to tell you that he is also a LARC2 G2019S variant carrier. And it was my time for my annual research visit at Mount Sinai in New York. He decided to come with me and participate. And I know some people might think, wow, he's awfully young to, first of all, know his genetic risk and participate in research. But you know, my son was born in the same year that my dad was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and he never knew his grandfather without it. And he grew up kind of learning firsthand the life cycle of the disease. And he's curious, and by participating in research, he's learning. And I feel like he really should start those lifestyle interventions as soon as possible. It takes a while to develop those good habits. And the second update I wanted to share is that my uncle, my dad's older brother, found out that he had a brain tumor in April of this year after several falls. And he was transferred to Mass General where he had the meningioma removed. And you know, at first everyone attributed all of his symptoms to the tumor, but we've known for many years that my uncle also carried the LARC2 G2019S variant. And my uncle was finally diagnosed with Parkinson's by a neurologist here at Mass General following his rehab stay after the surgery. So looking at my dad and my grandfather and comparing their age of onset to my uncle, there's a significant difference there. There's 31 years between age of diagnosis between my uncle and his father, my grandfather. And my uncle and my dad have a female first cousin on their dad's side that was recently diagnosed with Parkinson's at the age of 75. But it was found that she does not have the LARC2 G2019S variant. So it made me wonder about what other additional genetic considerations that there might be going on in my family. And so I had whole exome sequencing done several years ago, and I actually did find 2 variants related to Wilson's and spastic paraplegia type 7. And of course, they both have Parkinsonian features. And I looked up the SNP numbers in my dad's and my uncle's raw data in 23andMe, and I found that both my dad and I are heterozygous for all 3 of the variants, but my uncle is only heterozygous for the LARC2 G2019S variant. And the ATP7B and the SPG7 variants are also relatively rare. They're also recessive, and it looks to be pathogenic. And I thought about GBA and how heterozygous carriers may not get Gaucher's disease, but they're at increased risk for Parkinson's. And the question I had was, how often do we see doctors and researchers stopping once they find the LARC2 G2019S variant? And how often are other neurological conditions with overlapping symptoms considered on the gene panels? And penetrance, of course, is another major topic when you talk about genetic risk. And penetrance estimates are population specific. And most people refer to that 26% estimated penetrance of the LARC2 G2019S variant in Ashkenazi Jewish. And while I have about a 10.5 to 12% estimated Ashkenazi ancestry, I'm mostly mixed European, and those estimates are a little bit higher at about 43%. And so you really have to consider the individual when developing enrollment models and inclusion criteria, because if someone asked me if I had Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, I do. It's just a consideration of how much ancestry I have. So one of the things that frustrates me is that in my experience, primary care physicians and most neurologists really have no idea what LARC2 is. And I believe that how clinicians react to someone telling them that they have a genetic variant can be greatly improved. The most common reaction that I get is that they ignore me. And my uncle knew for many years that he had a LARC2 G2019S variant, but his doctor would never acknowledge it. His primary care physician insisted that he had essential tremor, and he refused to refer him to a neurologist. My uncle really didn't know how to advocate for himself. So I like that the Parkinson Study Group had a boot camp about genetics targeted at clinicians. I think it's important to spread awareness about the resources available to clinicians regarding genetic risk so that we can prepare for more widespread Parkinson's prevention efforts. And another thing that I sometimes see is that non-manifesting carriers are referred to as asymptomatic, but I really don't think that's true. When you consider the prodromal or preclinical period being decades long, there's plenty of non-motor things that are happening. And I don't want to wait to intervene until I'm right on the verge of diagnosis. For me, I think that's too late. And I have irritable bowel syndrome. My right arm has not swung for 5 years now. And I have anxiety and I have chronic headaches. And I need to feel like people are listening to me and not brushing me off. It's a very difficult and awkward conversation when I know more about the LARC2 G2019S variant than my own gastroenterologist, and it's hard to explain the gut inflammation to them. That is where I think advocacy and health literacy programs can help bridge that gap for people at risk so they can feel more confident developing those relationships with their clinicians. And reduced penetrance is clearly another thing that is a challenge for prevention trials in those genetically at risk. However, I also want to point out that there's advantages as well, as carriers can be easily identified and interventions can start early. And finally, I think it's hard sometimes for those already diagnosed with PD to hear about prevention trials. There's this perceived competition for attention and resources. But I think if the targets are diversified and the funding is balanced between all stages, and there's emphasis on reducing waste, I think there's hope that we can make progress on multiple fronts. We just have to be very sensitive about that messaging in the broader community. So to summarize, we would truly have to listen to those at risk for Parkinson's. Don't patronize us. Even if we don't have all the classic symptoms to justify a formal diagnosis, we have valid early concerns and we want you to acknowledge them as important. And next, in preparation for prevention trials, we need to spend time and resources educating clinicians about Parkinson's risk. It would likewise be helpful to invest in health literacy and advocacy programs to empower individuals to have the confidence to communicate with their doctors. And lastly, we're all unique. Individuals are not averages. I think it's really important to take a personalized approach to prevention strategies. My hope is that 20 years from now, I can look back and know that targeted interventions to prevent neurological diseases from ever affecting my children are a reality. I remain optimistic that we're making meaningful progress towards our collective efforts in prevention research. Thank you.
There's time for a few questions for Jessie. Folks. Boss.
So very inspiring to hear you. Wonderful for disclosing that here. So if I were you, so under opportunities, I didn't see the possibility to intervene now. If I were you, if I had that genetic, say, quote unquote, time bomb in my brain, I would read up on the literature, read about exercise, Mediterranean diet, coffee, avoiding milk, avoiding exposure to pesticides, avoiding exposure to TCE, and do everything I can today, not wait for the trials.
Right.
That's not under opportunities. Is that, how does that work for you and for your family members?
Yeah, I'm absolutely doing that now. I mean, and I'll tell you, and I know your boss, and so you're all about the exercise. And honestly, growing up, I hated exercise. I hated it, but I know how important it is. So I used to dance when I was younger, so I'm taking dance classes again. So I take adult tap, I take adult jazz, and I take adult hip hop, and because dance is something that's fun for me, and then I will do it, So I'm absolutely trying to do the best I can. Historically, my levels of B12 and vitamin D have been low, so I'm trying to do that more. And trying to eat better, so absolutely those things. And that's why it's so important to have those kinds of education things now. When people learn that they have a genetic risk, that we make sure that we're educating people about what they can do. Hi.
You raised the question. Thanks.
Hi, Claudia Testa. Thanks for a great talk. I was really struck by a lot of the positivity, especially on the front end, talking about both yourself and your son. I'm currently at University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill starting up a neurogenetics program. I'm lucky to working with a couple of amazing genetic counselors. We're all very comfortable with working with at-risk populations, including doing testing. But what I'm hearing from a lot of my new colleagues is a lot of fear, a lot of concern that are they doing the right thing, getting involved in testing or even talking with at-risk populations. Is testing going to have these terrible negative consequences for people? A lot of fear about just uncertain, how will they handle uncertain results? I'm like, that's what our genetic counselors are for. But, it's not a pushback, it's more, there's all this sort of kind of blobby concern on the parts of the providers who are coming to us and saying, we hear you and we're hearing the community, but we're still kind of nervous. And so how would you respond to the providers out in the community who are trying to kind of feel their way towards connecting more with what you're saying?
Right. Yeah, I hear that a lot. A lot of people are fearful of that. But I feel like really it's up to the individual. Everyone has different life experiences and personalities that respond to genetic testing differently. For me, like I said, it's been a very positive experience. And I'll say that I don't like the language, we don't recommend testing in non-manifesting carriers. Because especially when I first learned my genetic risk, it felt like I was doing something bad because I chose to learn my genetic risk. I feel like people have a right to know and people have a right not to know. And so don't make me feel bad because I chose to learn my genetic risk. It doesn't have to be a bad thing. I already knew that I was high risk because of the family history. And it's helped me actually knowing my genetic risk because I can participate more in research, and it's had a very positive experience on me. So I think people are naturally very fearful of that, but I think if you leave it to the individual, present the pros and cons, and then let the individual decide what they want to know.
One more question?
Yeah, you raised a question about variants in 2 other genes, right,
Mhm.
that you were tested for. And I was wondering, you didn't say whether you understand the significance of those variants or whether you met with the geneticist to discuss that.
Right. I mean, I know generally about the copper and about the mitochondria implications in the spastic paraplegia, but a lot of people, because I had whole exome sequencing done myself, when you present, a lot of people don't know about the genetic implications of those things. So I did tell my neurologist, about them, but because they're recessive genes, it doesn't really seem to be that of significance. My question is that, as in the research community as a whole, maybe those variants, they're not very common. Maybe in my family, that might explain some of the penetrance. That might explain why my grandfather had Parkinson's at 45. My dad was diagnosed at 52. We have to kind of explore more of that when we're doing research, I think.
Thanks, Jesse.
Thank you.
And please keep at it. The pushback you're getting from even clinicians, let alone family and the like, it's because you're a pioneer, and it is difficult because, and people will ask, why are you doing it? But if you don't do this, and we don't do this, then we won't get to the point when it'll be obvious why people are looking into it, because there'll be treatment. So it's a very logical thing you're doing, and thanks for pushing back against those who don't. And then our next speaker from a very different perspective, John